You are also currently the director of the National Center for the Study of Privatization in Education. David Berliner acknowledges your center, and your research here is most notable, as you have served as fair broker in these areas. How would you evaluate the school choice system thus far?
Well, my evaluation would be to say that there's a lot less that meets the eye in a lot of respects, and a lot more that meets the eye in other respects. A lot less that meets the eye is the kind of differences that we see in the schools themselves are very small. Charter schools in particular were supposed to be incubators of ideas, not tried by public schools. I don't think that there's a single idea that you'll find in charter schools that you wouldn't find in public schools. If we look at studies of just the test scores, which I'm not excited about as the only criterion for judging the quality of an educational experience, but if we look just at that because that's what the evaluators look at, there's no systematic difference in terms of test score results. The more than the eye can see is the effect of the schools on stratification. And stratification in terms of values, in terms of SES, in terms of race, in terms of even within race, cream skimming of others. And that's not measured and not discussed. There's very little of that going on. Gene did an early study in Arizona, but because this movement has gone so quickly, what he did around 2000 is no one takes seriously because they say, well, there were, I don't know, 25 or some relatively small number of charter schools in Arizona in those days. And now it's, Arizona has never seen a charter school that it didn't think was great, although that's changing too. There is some concern now in Arizona, but where it will go. So vouchers, I think you have a similar picture. We have no real evidence that vouchers improve performance. What they do is they do build on one value that's important to Americans, and that is freedom of choice. Not being told this is the school you have to go to, but being able to choose the school. But in terms of the consequences for equity, for social cohesion of the population, for productivity achievement, some of those just haven't been looked at. Issues of social cohesion. Do we really prepare people to work together politically and socially in this society by emphasizing choice and privatization? There's some real questions about that, but there are also some that are reassuring, some segments. For example, in the time that I've looked at the Catholic schools, I think that the Catholic schools do a really excellent job for most dimensions of social cohesion. So even generalization is hard. Evangelical Protestant schools, no, they really try to separate people from other people, and they emphasize the scriptures as determining what is right, but not democratic processes. You see, so anyway, it's a much more complicated area. That's also the part that there's much more that does not meet the eye. It's much more complicated than privatization, non-privatization, or choice versus non-choice overly simplifies the issues tremendously.
When you reflect on your career, where do you believe you have had the greatest impact?
Well, it's clear that I've had this sounds selfish, but the greatest impact on my own personal development by far. You know, I mean, I know that's a selfish answer, but I think it's very difficult to understand, number one, whether you've had an impact and whether the impact has been positive and in what ways. I would be very disappointed if my students didn't say that I was very supportive of them and that I worked closely with them and that I cared about their work and their futures. I would be very disappointed if they wouldn't agree with that statement. So I have to say that. But in terms of the ideas and the other activities and the teaching it's so difficult to know. I do. Some people are very kind and give very, very nice feedback even years later. Having said that, though, you always have a small sample and a selective sample. I just got a book which made me cry. There's a book called Dropping Out by Russell Rumberger, just published by the Harvard University Press. And in the preface, he thanks me in a long paragraph for having nurtured his career and given him certain values and things like that. Well, that made me cry because I guess if I wanted to hear something about my influence, those are exactly the words that I would want to hear. But again, we're all victims of selective sampling and selective perceptions.
So what's next for you? What haven't you accomplished that you'd still like to achieve?
Well, I haven't accomplished old age, so that's going to be one challenge. Real old age. I mean, I know to some people my chronological age is already old age, but it isn't to me. I have a lot of ideas that I'm continuing to work on. One is very consistent with accelerated schools, but it's also much more social scientific-y, you might say, and that is expanding legitimacy of what schools do and need to do outside of narrow test scores in a couple of subjects. In other words, moving away from just the criticism of that back to what accelerated schools tried to do, and emphasizing the positive importance of a lot of these other things. And I've been writing some papers on so-called non-cognitive outcomes of schooling, and we'll continue to work on that. I'll continue to work on trying to say, gee, cost effectiveness isn't all that difficult. It's there. We've written up the work so that people from psychology and educational psychology and sociology and so on can do it with a little help, and encouraging that as a way of thinking about how we deal with the problem of very limited resources now.
What inspires you?
Well, what inspires me in terms of movements, personal commitments, what inspires me are social movements that are just. For example, the present movements on occupying Wall Street. I know that's hard. I know they don't have a single message, but you have to get people involved. You have to change their awareness of how important it is to get involved instead of just sitting around bitching or blaming themselves, and so that definitely inspires me, as did the anti-war movement that we were involved in.
What do you find uninspiring?
So much of educational policy I find uninspiring. The emphasis just on the narrow test score criterion. The notion that schools must be ruled by regulations rather than by ideas and excitement and collaboration in behalf of certain really good principles and outcomes. I think that the educational system, while I'm defensive when people just criticize teachers and say they're responsible, and it's not, I don't think that that's partly the case. I can tell you I've been in some classrooms that just shouldn't happen, and if I had the power, I would immediately stop it. It's outrageous. I've been in classrooms that are so inspiring, so exciting. And if you were to ask what's the difference between the two, I would say partly one operates without worrying about regulations, and partly the other one is protected by bad regulations. So I think that education as a regulatory movement is not going to get there. I do realize that we do have to have certain principles and certain certain boundaries that schools must operate within. And that's not altogether bad. I want schools, for example, that get kids to be able to work together with other people ultimately as adults in communities, things like that. In a school that just tells a child, no, you're an individual and whatever you do is up to you, and no, you don't have to agree with anyone else on a procedure to solve a dispute. I think that's wrong, and that's injurious to having a good society. But I think that these are broad things, and the idea that so much has to be regulated, I think, is wrong.